Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks very much for inviting me today, Kevin. So I've been asked to speak for about 12 minutes on the subject of legitimacy, so we'll see whether I can manage to do that. I guess the first thing to say right at the outset is when I say legitimacy for the next 12 minutes, I'm talking about the empirical legitimacy of the police, i.e. the legitimacy of the police from the perspective of the policed. There's a different account of legitimacy which you could characterise as a normative account, i.e. the things that actually make the police legitimate when they're held up against established legal or moral or ethical norms. And obviously those two things are going to overlap, but they don't collapse into each other. So it's perfectly possible, in fact, I think quite likely, that people across the world in different jurisdictions believe their police to be legitimate, whereas if you looked in from the outside, that police organisation wouldn't actually be legitimate in a normative sense because it didn't live up to established legal or ethical practices. So I'm talking about the legitimacy of the police from the perspective of the policed. And there's a number of ways you could kind of frame any discussion of legitimacy in the context of policing, one of which would just be to say that all institutions, or people will say that all institutions need legitimacy to establish and reproduce themselves over time. I think that's a big ask actually, but I think we're certainly when you're talking about the police in the context of a liberal democracy, they require legitimacy to function effectively in the short term, and they require legitimacy for their continued survival in their current organisational form over the medium to long term. Another way to think about why legitimacy is interesting and important is because it's intimately linked to power. So wherever you have questions of power, you have questions of legitimacy. So when is the power that the police wield considered to be justified on the part of those against whom that power is wielded? And that's particularly pertinent in this context, of course, because of the traditional difficulty of controlling and constraining the power of the police. We don't have to think about this for any more than 2 seconds, but the police have a huge amount of power that's wielded at levels within the organisation that are generally invisible to people on the outside. Individual police officers have a huge amount of discretion vested in them. What they do is very much up to them in a very real sense, and it has classically proved difficult to place barriers around their use of that power with all the implications that had over the years. And one of the ways you can think about what legitimacy does in the relationship between police and policed is to help regulate or control or constrain this power, which in some technical legal sense can be considered to be unbounded, at least in certain important ways. And I think it does that. I think the quest for legitimacy that the police are always engaged in does place limits around the power that they can wield, but actually legitimacy also enables that power. So legitimate police organisations can do things that illegitimate police organisations can't do, and that has both good and bad implications. I've already kind of alluded to this in some sense. This slide is an amalgam, you could say a brazen amalgam of the kind of some of the legal theorists in this area. So people like Tom Tyler, Tony Bottoms and Justice Tanqueray at Cambridge. Jean-Paul Quacquot is a French kind of political philosopher. And they basically, if you kind of distill down their ideas about what legitimacy is and looks like, it looks something like this. So they would say that legitimacy exists in the relationship between the police and those they policed. Within that relationship, the police are continuously making claims about their own legitimacy, implicitly or explicitly. The public receive and process those claims, judge them in some way, and the legitimacy in that relationship then becomes an emergent property of that process. So legitimacy is a dialogue between the police and the police. It consists in that dialogue. And once legitimacy is established, or when legitimacy is there to some extent, so legitimacy is a continuous variable, it's not a binary variable. It's never just there or not there. It's always there or not there to some degree on some kind of scale. But when you have legitimacy in that relationship, it secures public cooperation and compliance. So people do the things that police officers ask them to do, for example. It does tame the power of the police, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And crucially, I think this may almost be the most important bit here. It reduces the tension between power holders and subordinates. Policing is always filled with tension. Policing is always filled with discord and debate. That's just inevitable. That's what policing is about. Where there's legitimacy, it reduces that. It keeps a lid on that discord and debate and allows police organisations to function in an effective way. Classically, I think, and masses of evidence suggests this is true. We've already talked about procedural justice, so I won't spend more than 2 minutes on this. There's a huge amount of evidence from across the world that one of the most important predictors of the legitimacy of the police is the procedural fairness by which people perceive the police to be operating. Whether that's at the level of interpersonal interaction, so when people encounter police officers, does this police officer treat me fairly, with respect, with dignity, etc., etc. People draw lessons from the way they're treated by the police, and at a more general way as well. So people have a general impression that police behave in a procedurally fair or a procedurally unfair way, and they take lessons from that general perception, which is obviously going to have many, many different sources. Media might be one. The stories their friends and families tell about the police might be another. Their cultural repertoire might be another. There's a famous question in the British Crime Survey which asks people where they get most of their information about the police from. And something like 10 or 15% of people are prepared to say they get most of their information from the police from drama on television. And they're the ones who are prepared to say that. So there's a cultural repertoire that surrounds this that affects the way that people think about policing. So there's this really consistent link between procedural justice and legitimacy. So why is procedural justice linked to legitimacy at the level of the experience of individual people? Well, we tend to think there are two paths linking procedural justice and legitimacy. One is a direct path. And I think here the idea would be that perhaps as a result of processes of legal socialisation, we have an image of the way that police officers should behave. They should be exemplars of good conduct. They should treat people fairly and with respect and dignity, etc., etc. So when we encounter police officers, when we think about policing, we hold police officers and the police organisation up against those standards. We make active judgments about the way that we think the police hold. So there's this kind of direct path between procedural justice and legitimacy. There's also an indirect path, which may or may not be the more important one, we're not entirely clear on that, which is via social identification. So the idea here would be that police represent a social group which the vast majority of people actually find important in some way, which you could characterise as a nation or the state or a community of belonging and effect within a particular jurisdiction. When police officers deal with people face-to-face and again in various mediated ways, they communicate messages about the inclusion, status, belonging of that individual within the group the police represent. So when police officers treat people fairly, they feel included, they feel that they belong, they feel that they have status. Therefore, this motivates legitimacy, because we're motivated to legitimate authorities of groups to which we feel we belong. When police officers treat people unfairly, when people perceive the police to be unfair, they experience a sense of denigration, exclusion, they're being pushed out of this group. When you feel pushed out of a group, you're less motivated to legitimise its structures of authority in some way. So it's an evaluative and effective path between procedural justice and legitimacy. I think it's important to say that it's not all about procedural justice. There's lots of other factors going on shaping people's legitimacy judgments, one of which might be something what you could characterise as bounded authority. This is based on some work that started to come out from the United States, particularly a guy called Rick Trinkner, who's at Yale. And he thinks that bounded authority, or the extent to which police operate within the proper boundaries of the powers vested within them, people will base their legitimacy judgments in part on their perceptions of this. So when people think that police exceed their authority, abuse their power, act as if they're above the law, violate people's freedoms, etc., etc., they're going to start withdrawing legitimacy from the police on that basis. So you could talk about procedural justice and whether the police operate within the boundaries that's been established for the use of power that they hold. So I talked a lot about what might in 5 minutes, what might be the basis of people's legitimacy judgments. What does legitimacy actually look like from the perspective of an individual person? Well, Kevin's already talked about this. I think it's probably quite important to say that if you ask people, do you think the police are legitimate? Lots of people would find that question quite hard to answer. This is not everyday language. This is not the kind of way, this is not the kind of terms we're used to using in everyday discourse. So we don't do that. We don't ask people, do you think the police are legitimate? What we actually do is ask them a set of questions and use the answers to those questions to build up measures of things that we think, psychological constructs, are unobservable because they sit in people's minds, but which we think go together in some sense, form the legitimacy from the police, from the perspective of an individual person. And we tend to think at the moment that notion of legitimacy, that concept of legitimacy has at least two components, one of which we could characterise as duty to obey. So we ask people such questions as, to what extent do you think it is your moral duty, and that's important by the way, your moral duty to back the decisions made by the police because the police are legitimate authorities, back the decisions made by the police even when you disagree with them. So this is really tapping into the idea that when people believe the police are legitimate, that sets up, if you like, a reciprocal duty on them to obey the instructions of police officers. So this is about recognition of justified power. When power is justified, I have a sense of duty towards that justified power, that justified authority. We think legitimacy has got at least one other important component, and I would argue the more important component, the most important component. And we tend to call that something like normative alignment. So measure that by questions such as, to what extent do you agree or disagree that the police usually act in ways that are consistent with my own ideas, right and wrong? can be trusted to make the right decisions, stand up for values that are important to people like me. So this is really people holding the police up against their own normative frameworks. And when the police appear to be operating in a way that matches or maps onto their own normative and moral frameworks, then legitimacy emerges in that relationship. When people think the police aren't behaving that way, legitimacy isn't a characteristic of that relationship. Legitimacy isn't a characteristic of people's psychological orientation towards the police. Just to ram home that we find incredibly strong correlations between procedural justice and legitimacy, as I've just described it, from the perspective of individual people, that is. So for those of you who are interested in such things, if you do a simple linear regression or bivariate correlation between procedural justice and normative alignment, the R squared is 0.67. So we can explain 2/3 of the variation in people's sense of normative alignment with the police just by knowing how procedurally fair they think the police are. We get something similar with this perceived duty to obey. The correlation is slightly weaker, but the general idea is there. So the idea is that procedural justice leads to legitimacy, and then, of course, importantly, and I guess this is where the kind of the policy relevant stuff comes in, legitimacy leads to increased compliance, deference to police officers, acceptance of police decisions, etc., etc. Procedural justice seems to be the most important predictor of legitimacy, but it's not the only one. I think the key point here in terms of what I said at the beginning is this quest for legitimacy that the police have to engage in. The police require legitimacy among those they police, serves to constrain or limit the power of the police because they can't just do what they want. They're having to always think about or act in ways that will reproduce their legitimacy at some overall level. Of course, that's not what every individual officer is always doing, but at some overall level, that's what's going on. So that means, most importantly, they have to behave in as procedurally fair way as possible. But that raises some questions, one of which is, of course, police often have in the past and continue to do so, behave in procedurally unfair ways, yet the legitimacy of the police hasn't collapsed. We live in a country where legitimacy, trust, confidence, whatever you want to call it, public trust and confidence, legitimacy in the police is, some would say, surprisingly high. I wouldn't say that, but it is quite high. It hasn't collapsed as a result of 40 years of policing scandals. One of the reasons for that is there are other sources of legitimacy. The legitimacy judgments that people make, the types of relationships people imagine they have with the police aren't only based on procedural fairness. I could give you a whole host of possible sources of police legitimacy that exist outside the realm of procedural fairness. One, of course, is police effectiveness. We shouldn't forget that. That's in the mix somewhere. Another is precisely this idea of social identity. So remember I said that one of the reasons why procedural justice is linked to legitimacy is because social identity forms a bridge within that relationship. So one question is what does that social identity look like? We tend to measure it by sets of questions which ask people, to what extent do you think it's important? To what extent is being British important to the way you see yourself? To what extent is being a law-abiding citizen important to the way you see yourself? Most people feel British. Most people think they're law-abiding citizens. And then we ask people about whether they think it's important that other people see them in that way. And what we find is answers to those questions load onto one underlying factor in the same way again that Kevin just described, which you could call law-abiding British citizen if you want. Most people identify strongly with that identity. That identity is linked strongly to people's legitimacy judgments. So independent of the extent to which they think the police are fair and they think the police are effective, when people identify with those social groups, they're motivated to grant the police legitimacy for a whole host of good social psychological reasons that we could go into later if you want. And I think one of the things that's going on here is this identification process that links, for example, the police with images of nation, the state, law-abiding citizen, acts as a reservoir of support for the police, against which instances of procedural unfairness can be offset. So legitimacy is constantly being topped up, if you like, by the extent to which police are associated with these forms of identities in people's minds. What does that do? Well, I think one of the things it does is open up the space where we can start thinking about the way that legitimacy doesn't just constrain police power, but enable police power. So one of the characteristics of being a legitimate authority are people are motivated to support you, whatever it is you've done. That's one of the defining characteristics of police. I have a duty towards you to do what you ask me to do, regardless of whether I understand the reasons that you've asked me to do that. For example, that's another question that's very commonly asked. And if legitimacy is constantly being topped up by processes that exist outside of procedural fairness, outside of effectiveness, this very much opens up space for which legitimacy can allow the police to do things some of which may be good, some of which may be bad. So there's a paradox here, right? Legitimacy both constrains and enables police power. And I think that's just the way the world is. We just have to think of ways of working with that paradox. Just to finish before the end, I've talked about procedural fairness, I've mentioned effectiveness, I've touched on social identity. There are lots of other things going on to shape the legitimacy of the police. And we've really got quite a poor understanding of what those other things are at the moment, and a poor understanding of the way those processes play out in, for example, the way that people experience and read particular police behaviours. And I think, final bullet, the legitimacy of the police, legitimacy of any social institution, but I think particularly legitimacy of the police, is a dynamic process. It's always in flux. It's going to be marked by significant periods of stability, but it's also going to be marked by significant periods of change and potentially ruptures. So you can think about the way, for example, riots emerge in a particular social context as being a rupture in police legitimacy at that time. And I'll finish there.
Just got a question about the survey instrument itself. I guess this is an issue about uncertain reasoning and or maybe uncertainty about reasoning. Completing surveys, public surveys, requires a certain socio-technical proficiencies, which mean that some people are good with surveys and other people aren't. So how far can we actually go with public surveys and related big data in eliciting knowledge about confidence, legitimacy and trust? Like, how good are surveys as a research instrument for dealing with these types of problems?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. Surveys are just one methodology, and it's important to use other methodologies. I think the strengths they have, in addition to those ones, I think that they're very good at looking at correlations between variables. They're not so good at looking at mean levels of variables for all the reasons to do with sampling. And the example of the last general election is a really good reason why we shouldn't trust survey estimates of point estimates of, in that case, voting behaviour as much as we used to. The kind of techniques we use are very good at addressing some of the concerns you raise. So we're good at estimating bias and error in the measures. And the techniques can cope with that. So it can cope with the idea that people give slightly different answers to questions depending on the format of the question, etc., etc. But they're only ever going to be one tool in the toolbox. And actually, if I can say one more, I think one of the dangers with the evidence-based policing programme is it goes too far down an RCT survey-based route and doesn't pay enough attention to the kind of qualitative work that you absolutely need to bring into the mix as well.
I wanted, I suppose, to make some comments about the whole concept of legitimacy, and I suppose look at it from a slightly different direction. As you may gather from my accent, I'm from Northern Ireland, and I was very conscious, Ben, when you were talking about your surveys and asking people if they, if they bought into the concept of Britishness, that you clearly weren't asking anyone in Northern Ireland if they did, because it's really, I know, and it's kind of interesting, because I think if you look at the process that the police in Northern Ireland have gone through in terms of legitimacy, it's been an entirely different one, where things like procedural justice weren't actually in the forefront. There were all sorts of other issues about symbolism and the makeup and just how the police organisation looked in itself that actually impacted enormously on whether it was regarded as legitimate. And I suppose that feeds into some of your material, Harry, in terms of the security sector reform processes in some of those countries that you would have mentioned. So I suppose when we think about, my question, if it is a question, is really how significant really is that wider concept of legitimacy in terms of makeup and symbols and things like dealing with the past? Harry talked a lot about some of the scandals that have engulfed policing, but I didn't hear things like the Birmingham 6 mentioned, or the Guildford 4 or the Maguire 7, and if you're coming from what is a very large policing organisation in Northern Ireland, those are really significant, and they're the biggest challenge that policing legitimacy faces in Northern Ireland at the moment around dealing with the past. So I think it's just a kind of trying to broaden it out slightly.
Yeah, I completely agree. One of the ways you could think about the process that Northern Ireland has gone through, it is actually to do with social identity. But what it was about was decoupling the identity of the police with one particular community. So it's there, but it's in a different form. And I think a lot of this comes back to social identity, but it doesn't collapse into social identity. And actually one of my PhD students is doing his research on the extent to which the Human Rights Act and all that, the surrounding paraphernalia within Northern Ireland is used as a legitimacy claim in the way that Tony Bottoms and Justice Tanquay have talked about by PSNI to kind of demonstrate that's their side of the dialogue that we've bought into and are applying human rights-based policing. And I think one of the interesting things that he seems to be finding is that's a discourse at the top level, but when you go down to the everyday practice of the cops on the beat, you're not quite sure that's exactly what's going on, and actually it looks very much like policing in other contexts. But absolutely, I agree. So when we're thinking about legitimacy as a dialogue and the police communicating and making claims about their own legitimacy, lots of things go into that side of the dialogue. And procedural fairness and social identity, that's just part of the mix. Yeah.
Just going back to what the gentleman from De Montfort said, and I'll touch a little bit of this when I talk after lunch, if anyone's still here after lunch, but I'm sure they will be, Kevin. I think no matter how good a survey is, and we do learn every time we do, and I think there was some significant learning from the 2013-14 when I did a test within West Midlands. But one of the issues I think we'll constantly face, even if it's a qualitative approach, is you ask 10 different people a question with the word confidence in there and the words local police. They will have different experiences and ideas of what confidence means to them and what local police means to them. And I think no matter whatever approach you take, that will always be a shortcoming within the measure that we put in place for measuring confidence. And I mean, I certainly think in terms of what Kevin talked about, having faceted ways of doing it is the right way. But still, we go back to that original point, which is, in my view, that massive difference for different people based on their experiences, on their neighbourhoods, their contact or not with the police, of what confidence actually means to them.
I mean, I agree to a point, but I think there's an important distinction here between, and again, goes back to the point I made before, between the mean level of a variable and the correlation of that variable with other variables. And yeah, if you ask people a set of questions about their confidence in local policing, and you either use them as indicators in their own right, or you'll combine them into another measure, which is by far the preferable way to do it, and you calculate a mean level, that's going to vary across individual people. And the way that individual people arrived at that final decision, if you like, is going to vary across those individual people. But what you're looking for is regularities in the way that they reach that decision. And the regularities are really consistent, if you like. They're regular regularities across multiple different contexts. If you ask people these questions, they're thinking about how fair the police are, both to them personally, to other people like them, if they've got that knowledge, or about how fair they think the police are behaving in a general sense. They're thinking about whether the police are engaged in their community care, what they think, do the things that they ask them to do. And they're thinking about effectiveness. So if I call these guys, are they going to turn up and look like they give a damn when they do turn up? Those kind of questions. That's not saying that everyone thinks in those ways, but the regularity is really quite striking. And I suppose the challenge starts to emerge if you can identify particular communities or particular groups of people who don't fit the regularity, who don't care about one or all of those three things in some overall sense. That might be where the challenge is, and that might actually be where the interesting levers for change are, because I suspect where you've got communities who don't care about those things, you've got big problems.
I just wondered about whether you'd unpack the concept of legitimacy, because there are different types and different levels, and it seemed that maybe the duty to obey seems a bit fits with a kind of pragmatic legitimacy, which is a weaker form, but is enough to kind of stop the system collapsing, whereas the normative alignment is a kind of moral legitimacy, which the police are searching for, would like to strengthen, but that's something that's more difficult to attain. And so it may be that, as you described, the system doesn't collapse because there's this certain level of a weaker form of legitimacy at work.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the useful ways about treating it as separate components is you can start to think about the way that the different components are going to be more or less present in particular circumstances. And I absolutely agree that the normative alignment component is the kind of at the core. And I think there's a sense in which almost undoubtedly the duty to obey flows from moral and normative alignment. I feel that you are doing the right thing, therefore I have a duty to do the right thing by you, which is by your instructions. So yeah, and I mean the slightly complicating factor is I suspect they're both equally stable, and it goes back to this kind of group identity aspect of legitimacy. And when you feel securely located within a particular social group, which most people do, it's just the way that we are, you're motivated to believe that the authorities of that group represent your own values because they're prototypical group representatives. That's the phrase from social psychology. So actually I think they're both quite stable, and that's the kind of slightly troubling bit here, because people consistently believe that the police abide by their own sense of right and wrong and do the things that they would like to do, and they kind of will ignore the situations where the police aren't doing those things because they're motivated to think the police are doing the right thing. So it actually starts to get slightly difficult, slightly complicated when you see it in those ways.
Does the issue of budgets, police pay and perceptions of declining professionalism, do they affect legitimacy?
To which I just add, yeah, I mean, I think the most important way those elements have an effect is within the police organisation itself, that kind of way. And I think they affect, or they have the potential to affect, the legitimacy claims that the police organisation is making. So if you've got a demoralised workforce who doesn't feel that they're supported, don't feel they're well paid, lots of things are happening around them that they don't understand for various reasons, their ability to act in ways that assert and reproduce their legitimacy is undermined because they don't feel that way within the organisation itself. And I suspect that's the most important way that those things might have an effect.